The tremor in my hand, slight as it was, betrayed the usual stoicism I cultivated. It was a failing I rarely permitted, especially when my compass lay true, its needle a faithful sentinel. For years, my life had been a series of precise lines in carefully rendered curves, each stroke of ink a testament to the patient pursuit of forgotten geographies. I was a cartographer, after all, a chronicler of the Earth's skin, and my world was one of immutable fact, of longitude and latitude holding fast against the tides of time. But the news, delivered by a solemn solicitor, had introduced an unexpected, sprawling uncertainty into my meticulously ordered existence, an ancestral estate, remote and decaying, now mine. The journey had been a descent into verdant gloom. The road, once paved, now surrendered to a mosaic of moss and cracked asphalt, the ancient trees forming a skeletal canopy that clawed at the overcast sky. When the gates finally loomed, rusted sentinels half swallowed by ivy, a chill, not entirely of the coastal air, seeped into my bones. The house itself was a behemoth of forgotten grandeur, its gray stone facade weeping black streaks where rain had carved its long, patient path. Turrets, like blind eyes, stared out over the desolate grounds, and the air, thick with the scent of brine and decay, carried a whisper of the sea's ceaseless murmur. Inside, the silence was a heavy shroud. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating ghosts of former inhabitants in the settled grime. Each step on the creaking floorboards felt like an intrusion, a desecration of a long-held vigil. My inheritance was less a home and more a mausoleum, filled with the hushed echoes of lives lived and secrets kept. It was a cavern of forgotten knowledge, shelves overflowing with brittle tomes, their pages yellowed like ancient parchment. The scent of old paper, leather, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like forgotten blood, hung heavy. My fingers, usually so deft with a pen, traced the spines, searching for some clue, some anchor in this sea of disquiet. It was in a hidden compartment, behind a sliding panel disguised as a section of faux books, that I found it. The box was lacquered wood, surprisingly well preserved, and within, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay the map. Not a typical survey, nor a common chart, but a thing of disturbing beauty. It was large, unrolled to reveal a parchment of incredible age, its edges frayed like ancient lace. The paper itself felt almost alive, warm beneath my touch, and its surface was covered in a breathtakingly intricate depiction of the estate and its immediate surroundings. Every contour of the land, every gnarled oak, every winding stream was rendered with a precision that rivaled my own exacting standards. I leaned closer, my breath catching. The detail was obsessive, verging on the pathological. I could almost feel the texture of the old stone walls, taste the salt on the sea wind, so vividly had it been etched onto the page. Yet, it was incomplete. Large sections, particularly those extending beyond the immediate estate boundaries, were blank, merely outlined in fainter ink, as if the cartographer had abruptly ceased their work, leaving vast swaths of potential unknown. And then there were the symbols. Not the familiar compass roses or cartouches I knew, but strange, angular marks, like forgotten runes, scattered across the map's surface. These marks pulsed with an unsettling energy, an unspoken narrative that prickled the hairs on my arms. One symbol, in particular, recurred with an unnerving frequency. It was a jagged, almost claw-like design, repeated near what appeared to be an underground structure, partially detailed but left without explanation. My cartographer's mind, accustomed to order and clarity, rebelled against this enigma. Why such meticulous detail in one area, and such an abrupt abandonment in others? What did these symbols signify? They were not merely decorative, they felt imbued with purpose, with a meaning that eluded me, yet beckoned. The map was an anomaly, a challenge, yes, but also a harbinger. As I studied the intricate lines and unsettling symbols, a profound sense of isolation settled over me. I walked to a window, pushing aside the heavy velvet curtains, and gazed out. Beyond the skeletal trees and the overgrown fields, the land sloped down towards the water. Through the deepening twilight, I could discern the vast expanse of the ocean shore at night with stationary waves. The water lay like a sheet of obsidian, reflecting the bruised sky, its surface strangely still, almost petrified. The waves, usually a symphony of crashing power, seemed frozen in place, their white crests held captive in an unnatural tableau, waiting. The sight was profoundly unsettling, a disruption of the natural order, mirroring the disquiet the map had stirred within me. It felt as though the entire world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for something to begin. And I, Reed, the cartographer of precise lines, was standing at its very precipice. The inherited map, a brittle skin of parchment and faded ink, lay spread across the scarred oak of the library table. My tremor, a fleeting weakness from the previous night, had retreated, replaced by the cool, hard resolve of my profession. A cartographer's truth was found in the land itself, not in the whispers of antique paper. I would walk the lines, verify the symbols, and reconcile this ancestral enigma with the stark reality of the estate. The morning air, though crisp, carried an unusual stillness. The gulls, usually raucous, were silent. My boots crunched on the gravel path as I ventured beyond the immediate manicured grounds, the heavy map case slung across my shoulder, a modern GPS unit clutched in my gloved hand. The estate boundaries, as depicted on modern deeds, were clear enough, a sprawling rectangle of overgrown forest and wild meadow, culminating in a ragged stretch of coastline. Yet, the inherited map told a different story, its delicate lines hinting at features that defied contemporary records. My first deviation from the expected came swiftly. Where the modern survey showed only dense woodland, the old map bore a faint, almost erased symbol, a cluster of 3 small, irregular circles. Pushing through a thicket of thorny brambles and ancient ivy that clotted my trousers, I stumbled upon it, the skeletal remains of a stone structure, swallowed by the earth and time. Moss, thick as a shroud, clung to the crumbling walls, obscuring their original form. A single, gnarled oak, its roots like grasping talons, had burst through the roofless shell, its branches reaching skyward as if in silent protest. No record, no photograph, no local lore had ever mentioned this forgotten shell. It was a phantom, an architectural whisper that existed only on my ancestral chart. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, a smell that seemed older than the moss itself. Further inland, the discrepancies deepened. They pooled like spilled ink, absorbing the light, creating pockets of impenetrable gloom where no rational explanation could account for their density. I found myself instinctively avoiding these spots, my footsteps veering around them, a prickle of unease tracing its way up my spine. Then came the markers. Half buried in the tangled undergrowth, I discovered the first one, a squat, unadorned stone, roughly hewn, its surface pitted and scarred by centuries of weather. It bore no inscription, no discernible purpose. Yet, when I checked the inherited map, a tiny, almost imperceptible crosshatch mark corresponded precisely to its location. There were others, scattered at seemingly random intervals, forming no obvious pattern of boundary or path. Some were upright, others toppled, but each, upon careful measurement, aligned with another of the map's cryptic symbols. They were like ancient teeth, jutting from the earth, silent sentinels to some forgotten arrangement. One, almost completely consumed by a sprawling root system, seemed to hum faintly beneath my fingertips, a vibration more felt than heard, a low, resonant thrum that faded the moment I tried to focus on it. It left my hand tingling, a peculiar phantom sensation. As dusk began to bleed purple into the sky, painting the clouds in bruised hues, the estate seemed to exhale. The peculiar sounds started. The low, mournful sigh of something vast and unseen, barely audible, like the intake of breath from a sleeping giant. I paused, my senses strained, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sounds were ephemeral, dissolving into the general creak and groan of the old house settling, or the distant call of an owl. The map, with its strange symbols and hidden structures, drew me inexorably towards the coast, its lines thickening to suggest something significant at the very edge of the property. The sight stole my breath. The sea, usually a restless churn of foam and fury, was utterly still. The waves, caught in some impossible stasis, held their crests suspended, frozen mid-break, like polished glass. The air itself felt thick, heavy, pressing down on me. My compass, usually a steadfast guide, spun wildly in my hand, its needle no longer tethered to magnetic north, but thrashing like a trapped bird. This was no mere cartographic anomaly. This was a place where the very fabric of reality felt thin, stretched taut and ready to tear. The estate, I realized, was not merely old and forgotten. It was alive, and it was waiting. I would decipher this inheritance, complete its missing lines, and lay to rest the unsettling whispers that clung to the estate like mist to a marsh. My purpose was clear, my hand steady as I reached for my drafting compass. Yet, a subtle distortion began to prick at the edges of my focus. A flicker at the very periphery of my vision, a shadow that wasn't there when I turned my head directly. It was like a moth darting past a lamp, too swift to properly register, leaving only the ghost of its passage. I blamed the old house, its ancient timbers shifting, the weak light from the leaded windows playing tricks. The first instance, a mere inconvenience. The 10th, a subtle irritation. Later, as the afternoon light bled into a bruised twilight, a new disturbance emerged. It wasn't distinct enough to form words, more a sibilant breath, a rustle of dry leaves caught in a phantom current. I paused, my pen hovering over a nascent contour line. "Hello?" I called out, the sound swallowed by the cavernous library. Only the house replied, with its familiar creaks and groans, and the distant, rhythmic sigh of the ocean. My rational mind offered swift explanations, the wind whistling through a loose pane, the settling of ancient foundations. But the sound had felt internal, a vibration within the stone itself. A few days later, the rationalizations began to fray. I found my worn leather-bound copy of the Antiquities of the Estate, a local history, not on the bookshelf where I always placed it, but face down on the small side table, a full 2 feet away. My spectacles, which I'd left beside the map, were now perched precariously on a stack of unrelated geological surveys. Each incident, isolated, could be dismissed as my own absent-mindedness, a trick of memory. But the cumulative effect, the quiet, persistent reordering of my small, meticulous world, began to chip away at my composure. I started to retrace my steps, to double-check, to consciously remember where I placed each item. Still, the subtle shifts persisted, like a playful, unseen hand rearranging my carefully constructed reality. Sleep, once a refuge, became a new battleground. The dreams began subtly, then grew in intensity. Always, there was a sense of something buried, something vast and hungry beneath the earth. One night, I dreamt of an immense eye, not human, not animal, but something primordial, gazing up from the deepest strata of the land, its lidless stare filled with an ancient, unbearable sorrow, yet also an unquenchable malice. The map, my anchor in this sea of unease, began to betray me too. I would return to it after a brief respite, and swear certain lines had deepened, or new, faint crosshatchings had appeared in previously blank spaces. A peculiar symbol, resembling a twisted, leafless tree, seemed to have bloomed in the corner of a previously empty quadrant, just at the edge of the property boundary. I scoured my memory, my notes, certain it hadn't been there before. I even compared it to old photographs of the map, taken by the estate agent, and the symbol was absent. It was as if the parchment itself was a living palimpsest, slowly revealing its hidden truths, or perhaps, its lies. Each new detail was not a helpful clue, but a further unsettling enigma. The growing unease became a physical weight, pressing on my chest, making the air in the house feel thick and stagnant. I needed to escape, if only for a few hours. There was no crashing foam, only a hushed, rhythmic sigh as the water met the sand, a sound that seemed to draw rather than push. But even here, at the edge of the world, the house pursued me. It was too regular to be a star, too faint to be a ship's light. It was a rhythmic, almost organic glow, like a deep breath taken and released. Read. The sound was so faint, so improbable, that I questioned my own sanity. The estate was not merely a place, it was an influence, a pervasive consciousness that reached beyond its crumbling walls, infecting even the wild, untamed sea. There was no escaping it. The entity, whatever it was becoming bolder, its presence no longer merely implied, but undeniably felt. The strange markings, the incomplete lines, the unnerving precision of its omissions, they were not errors, I now understood, but deliberate silences, pregnant with an unspoken history. I needed to fill them, not with guesswork, but with truth, no matter how unsettling. I began with the oldest volumes, their bindings cracked, their pages foxed with the breath of centuries. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the heavy drapes, like tiny, frantic spirits. My fingers, stained with the grime of forgotten knowledge, traced lines in leather-bound ledgers, deciphering the spidery script of long-dead kin. An ancestor's journal, bound in sun-faded vellum, spoke of a peculiar malaise of the spirit that afflicted the estate's occupants. Not explicit illness, but a creeping despondency, a waning of the inner light. Entries grew more erratic, the hand less steady. The earth calls, one passage read, a low hum beneath the floorboards, a vibration in the bones. It desires. His dog howled for 3 nights, then was silent. The land gives nothing back. The standing stones. I delved deeper, my eyes burning, my throat parched. Old correspondence, tied with brittle ribbons, revealed more. As if he simply walked into the earth. Each location, each cryptic reference, sent a shiver down my spine, for each corresponded to a peculiar, unmarked contour, a blank space, or a strange glyph on my map. The folklore was harder to pin down, scattered in the margins of almanacs and in the transcribed oral histories of the surrounding villages, collected by a local historian in the early 20th century. Tales of the deep earth's hunger, of the tribute paid, of the restless slumber beneath the roots of the world. They spoke of certain families, my own among them, who were bound to the soil, destined to remain, or to be reclaimed. Madness, disappearance, strange occurrences, a pattern began to emerge, stark and terrifying. The air in the library grew heavy, not with dust, but with the weight of forgotten sorrows. I felt a pressure, subtle at first, then insistent, against my temples, a low thrum that seemed to echo the ancient journal's mention of a hum beneath the floorboards. It wasn't my imagination, the very foundations of the estate seemed to vibrate with a suppressed energy. The stationary waves, an anomaly I'd rarely witnessed, seemed to hold their breath, as if listening. The air, thick with the scent of salt and decaying seaweed, offered no solace. Here, beneath the indifferent gaze of the cosmos, the stories I'd unearthed felt even more potent, more real. The vastness of the ocean, typically a source of perspective, now only amplified my isolation, the crushing weight of the estate's secrets. The map, under the flickering lamplight, no longer looked like an incomplete diagram of property lines. It was a diagram of suffering, a blueprint of malevolence. The cryptic symbols, the blank spaces, the lines that began and ended abruptly, they weren't just geographical markers. They were keys. Keys to the locations of the disappearances, the sites of the madness, the places where the land's hunger was most keenly felt. I was not just mapping a piece of land, I was mapping a prison, or perhaps a tomb. And I was already inside. I traced a finger along a newly discerned line, a faint, almost invisible etching that seemed to depict a subterranean passage far beneath the estate's ancient foundations. A cold draft snaked through the room, though no window was ajar, raising gooseflesh on my forearms. The first vision struck me not as a dream, but as a sudden, brutal intrusion into my waking sight. I was peering at the map, magnifying glass in hand, when the ink bled, not into a blur, but into a brief, horrific tableau. I saw a flash of churning earth, of gnarled roots like grasping fingers, and then, impossibly, a distorted face pressed against a barrier of stone, its features indistinct yet radiating an ancient, suffocating malice. "You open the way," a voice hissed, like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. I snatched my hand back from the map as if it had bitten me, my breath catching in my throat. Then came the physical intrusions. A heavy, leather-bound volume of local folklore, which I had carefully placed on a high shelf, tumbled to the floor with a deafening thud, its pages splaying like a broken bird's wings. The fragile glass of the library's leaded windows rattled violently, not with wind, but with an internal vibration that made my teeth ache. I spun, heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to find some logical explanation, some rodent or structural shift. There was nothing. I tried to reach out. I called a former colleague, a historian renowned for his knowledge of obscure local legends. The phone line crackled with static, a persistent, hissing interference that drowned out my increasingly desperate voice. "There's something here," I managed to shout into the receiver, "something tied to the land, to the family's past." His voice, when it broke through, was distant, tinged with a polite disinterest. "Reed, are you sure you're well? That old estate can play tricks on the mind." There was no one to believe me, no one to understand the insidious tendrils that were tightening around my perception of reality. The air was sharp with salt and brine, a clean counterpoint to the foul odor that clung to the estate. But even here, the entity's reach found me. The stationary waves, reflecting the moonlight, seemed to ripple with impossible patterns, forming fleeting, skeletal shapes in the silvered foam. The blood remembers. A presence solidified behind me, not a visual apparition, but a palpable shift in the air, a sudden, suffocating pressure that pressed against my back, stealing my breath. The metallic tang was stronger here, mingling with the salt. I spun, stumbling backward, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. There was nothing there. Only the vast, indifferent ocean and the mocking stillness of the waves. I ran back to the estate, the words echoing in my skull, the phantom touch of burning brand on my skin. It was a hungry, ancient thing, and it was reaching for me. Days had blurred into an obsessive cycle of tracing lines, comparing forgotten deeds, and sifting through the estate's dusty archives. I sought a pattern, a consistency that would complete the unfinished edges of the parchment. My fingers, stained with ancient dust, hovered over a peculiar symbol on the map's lower quadrant, a spiral within a broken circle, etched with a precision unlike the surrounding, more organic lines. Not the elegant cursive of my great-grandfather, nor the spidery scrawl of earlier generations. This was older, harsher, carved almost with a claw. I had found it tucked into the binding of a dilapidated almanac, a thin, unbound sheaf of vellum. The language spoke of the slumbering depth, the ravenous silence, and the great hunger beneath the earth. Now, holding the vellum beside the map, a shiver traced a path from my spine to the roots of my hair. The spiral within the broken circle on the map mirrored a symbol drawn repeatedly on the vellum, each iteration accompanied by the word, sealed. The text spoke of a prison of stone and tide, and of wardens of blood. The fragmented narrative, once a baffling collection of superstitions, coalesced into something monstrous. The map was not a guide to hidden wealth or lost land. It was a diagram of containment. Every line, every carefully marked point, every cryptic symbol pointed not to a treasure, but to a seal, a vast, subterranean confinement. And what it held was not a legend, but an ancient, malevolent force, a primordial hunger buried deep beneath the estate's foundations. The vellum described it as that which dreams of consumption, a presence so old, so vast, it dwarfed human comprehension. It was a force without form, only an eternal, gnawing desire. My breath caught, ragged in my throat. The tide recedes. I, Reed, the meticulous cartographer, had not merely inherited a crumbling estate. I had inherited a burden, a terrifying stewardship. The map, my obsession, was a blueprint for either maintaining a fragile barrier or, God forbid, inadvertently dismantling it. Was I drawn here by chance, or by the slow, inexorable pull of a weakening seal, beckoning a descendant to its aid? Or was it to be my hand that finally broke the final ward? The air in the library grew heavy, thick with an unspoken pressure. It was the groan of the prison, the stir of the ancient, ravenous entity beneath. I needed air, a clear horizon, something vast and indifferent to counter the suffocating revelation. The path, overgrown and treacherous, led me through the skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the moonless sky. The stationary waves, an unusual phenomenon here, held their crests in an unnatural stillness before collapsing into a long, drawn-out sigh against the sand. They weren't moving in rhythmic succession, rather, they seemed to hold their breath, poised and unmoving, like frozen specters on the water's surface, reflecting a dull, oily sheen. Here, under the immense, indifferent vault of the night sky, the true scale of my predicament crashed over me. The map's final, cryptic marking, a faint cross, was etched precisely where the land met the water, beneath the lowest tide line. The vellum described this exact spot as the Weeping Gate, where the entity's influence was strongest, its hunger most keenly felt. I knelt on the damp sand, the frigid air biting at my exposed skin. The rhythmic, almost imperceptible thrum that had started in the library seemed to intensify here, a low-frequency rumble that vibrated through the earth itself. It was the sound of a vast, ancient patience wearing thin, the sound of an immense pressure building. The map, this inheritance, was my undoing or my salvation. I was a cartographer, accustomed to lines and boundaries, to the tangible. Now, I faced an entity that defied all such definitions, an ancient malevolence that sought only release. And I, Reed, was the linchpin. The decision, terrible and solitary, rested with me, to complete the map, to strengthen the weakening seal, or to surrender to the insidious call of the deep, to become the unwitting instrument of its terrifying freedom. The stationary waves, like silent witnesses, held their breath, waiting for my choice. Sealed. The word thrummed in my mind, a counterpoint to the distant, unnatural quiet of the estate. And where else but the shore would such a prison lie? A cold compulsion, not my own, tugged at me. It was a thread woven through the fabric of the estate, now pulling taut, leading me past the skeletal trees, past the crumbling seawall, to the edge of the land. The moon, a chipped porcelain plate, hung low, bleeding a weak, silvered light across the water. The water, a vast, obsidian sheet, stretched out, not restless, not crashing, but utterly still. No rhythmic sigh of the tide, no frothing lace at the edge. Just a glassy expanse, holding its breath, reflecting the stark, unblinking eye of the moon. This was not the ocean I knew, a living, breathing entity. This was a tableau, a frozen moment in time, a mirror to the dread now blossoming in my own chest. My breath, shallow and ragged, seemed to shatter the stillness, echoing too loudly in my ears. The sand beneath my boots was damp, compacted, leaving no print, as if the very ground refused to acknowledge my presence. You come. It wasn't a voice I recognized, yet it was undeniably mine, twisting my own internal monologue into something alien and vast. It carried the scent of brine and ancient stone, of things long buried and now stirring. I clutched the vellum, its brittle edge digging into my skin. Release me, Cartographer. The thought resonated, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through my bones, a deep chord struck within the earth itself. It was seductive, promising an end to the gnawing unease that had plagued me since I first touched the map. It offered peace. My mind recoiled, a frantic bird beating against a cage. This was the lure. This was what the map had hinted at, what the vellum had warned against. The spiral symbol on the map, the broken circle, the repeated sealed on the vellum, they were not just historical curiosities. They were a cage, and I, Reed, was standing at its door. The pressure in my head intensified, a crushing weight. I stumbled back a step, my boots sinking slightly into the unyielding sand. The seal weakens. Your blood, your lineage. It calls to me. It has always called. The insidious voice slithered through my thoughts, wrapping around my resolve like tendrils of kelp. My fingers, still gripping the vellum, traced the raised, almost embossed lines of the sealed symbol. In that moment of desperate touch, a flicker of understanding, a sudden, blinding insight, pierced through the psychic assault. The vellum wasn't just a warning, it was a countermeasure. Not a physical lock, but an act of will, a reaffirmation. The prison of stone and tide wasn't merely a location, but a metaphysical construct, reinforced by intent, by a specific, potent focus. The broken circle, the spiral, they were not just symbols of the seal, but a diagram for its maintenance. The vellum spoke of binding the deep, of holding the surge, of the spirit's decree. It wasn't about building a new wall, but about reenacting the original act of containment. It required a sacrifice of self to the stillness, a surrender of will to the binding word. It demanded that the individual standing at the threshold become the conduit, the living anchor for the seal. The stakes, suddenly, were not merely my sanity, but the very integrity of the land, perhaps even beyond. The entity, if truly unleashed, would not merely haunt the estate, it would consume. Its hunger was for more than just my blood, it was for the vitality of the world, for motion, for life itself. To reseal it, I had to become the seal. I would have to become a guardian, eternally vigilant, forever entwined with the prison I sought to reinforce. The sacrifice was my peace, my freedom from this burden, perhaps even my very identity. The freedom awaits. Yours and mine. But I heard the lie beneath the promise. Its freedom meant my enslavement and the world's unraveling. My hands trembled as I gripped the vellum, my gaze fixed on the frozen ocean. The choice was stark: succumb to the lure, or offer my very essence to become the prison's living key. The weight of this ancestral curse, this ancient responsibility, settled upon me like the immovable stone of the earth. I was Reed, the cartographer, and now, I was the last line of defense against an ancient, devouring tide. The echo of that voice, undeniably mine yet vast as an ocean trench, still vibrated in the hollows of my bones. It had whispered of ancient stone, of briny depths, and in its wake, an unnatural clarity had settled upon me, cold and unyielding. It was a word that had surfaced from some forgotten recess of my mind, not spoken, but understood, a concept seated by the entity itself, a desperate, final gamble. I found myself drawn, not by conscious will, but by an inescapable pull, towards the lowest reaches of the estate. My feet, heavy as lead, carried me through the overgrown gardens, past the skeletal remains of what were once proud rosebushes, now gnarled and claw-like. But the waves. They did not break. They were frozen in an eternal, glassy undulation, crests poised, foam petrified into jagged white teeth. The brine on the wind was not merely scent, it was a taste on my tongue, a fine mist coating my skin, seeping into my very pores. In that unnatural quiet, the entity's presence was a palpable weight, pressing down from the sky, rising from the depths. It was here, in this impossible stasis, that the final resolve hardened within me. The ritual was not a choice, it was an imperative. I tore myself from the shore, the vision dissolving like smoke, replaced by the familiar, yet now infinitely more menacing, landscape of my inherited burden. I descended into the forgotten cellar, the stone steps slick with a persistent dampness. The true descent began behind a crumbling section of the cellar wall, where the map had hinted at a hidden passage. The air here was still, thick with the scent of wet earth and something else, a deep, mineral tang, like iron leaching from stone. The passage narrowed, the ceiling pressing low, forcing me to stoop. Each breath I took felt heavy, as if I were inhaling liquid stone. The entity's resistance began subtly. I pressed on, my jaw aching from clenching, my focus a desperate, fragile thing. The passage opened into a natural cave system, vast and echoing. The walls glistened with moisture, reflecting my lantern's glow in 1,000 distorted facets. It was the scent of something ancient, something that had died here long ago, but never truly departed. A new assault began, more direct, more insidious. Memories, sharp and painful, flickered through my mind, a childhood slight, a moment of profound loneliness, the face of a loved one twisted into a grotesque mask. These weren't just thoughts, they were vivid, tactile illusions, each designed to paralyze, to break my will. I saw my cartographer's desk, covered in maps, but the lines writhed like worms, and the names of towns bled into unspeakable glyphs. I fought against the tide of these mental onslaughts, reciting the names of constellations, the chemical composition of granite, anything to anchor myself to reality. Then came the physical obstacles. A section of the path ahead seemed to shimmer, the solid rock warping into a liquid undulation, as if the very cave were breathing. The entity was not merely playing with my mind, it was twisting the fabric of the cave itself. I chose the path that felt most wrong, most repugnant, trusting that the entity would try to lure me down the easier, more comforting route. My boots squelched with each step, the sound amplified and distorted by the cave's acoustics. Above, the stalactites hung like monstrous fangs, dripping a clear, cold water that tasted of minerals and something else. Something that left a faint, metallic aftertaste on my tongue. I passed through a chamber where the air was unnaturally warm, thick, and cloying, only to immediately enter another where a frigid gust of wind, smelling of glacial ice and putrefaction, swept through, threatening to extinguish my lantern. I had to perform the ritual. For the first time, I understood the depth of the entity's ancientness, the sheer, crushing weight of its existence. It wasn't just old, it was primordial, a force that predated the very concept of time, a hungry, waiting thing that had been slowly, patiently, drawing my lineage towards this inevitable moment. The reveal was not an object, but a terrifying, visceral understanding of my place in its long, slow awakening. I was merely a key, inherited across generations, destined to unlock its final release, or its ultimate demise. And I was determined it would be the latter. The path forward, once obscured by dread, now lay starkly illuminated, though the light was not of dawn, but of a cold, internal fire. My feet, heavy with purpose, carried me across the estate's grounds, past the skeletal trees and the whispering grasses, towards the source of that ancient whisper. The moon, a sliver of bone, hung low and indifferent, casting a sickly sheen upon the water. The sand beneath my boots was not soft, but compacted, almost crystalline, crunching with a sound like shattered glass. A faint phosphorescence pulsed in the water's depths, a slow, rhythmic throb that mirrored the beat of my own strained heart. From my satchel, I drew the map. It was no longer a mere parchment, but a living blueprint, its lines now pulsing with a faint, internal luminescence that defied the moonlight. The final, incomplete sections, once blank, had filled themselves in, not with ink, but with something akin to crystallized thought, a precise geometry of containment. I had spent the last hours, in that unnatural clarity, memorifying every symbol, every precise angle, every convergence point. My cartographer's mind, honed by years of meticulous work, had absorbed the language of its undoing. The ritual was a mapping in reverse, a dismantling of a presence through the very precision it abhorred. I used a sharp piece of obsidian, found years ago on this very shore and kept as a curiosity, to score the sand. Each line I drew was a boundary, each intersection a note of power. I marked the cardinal points, not by compass, but by the subtle, almost imperceptible pull of the earth itself, a knowledge that seemed to flow directly into my hands from the ancient map. The stationary waves loomed behind me, silent witnesses, their unmoving forms a testament to the entity's encroaching dominion. As the first lines etched themselves into the sand, a tremor ran through the ground, not a geological shift, but a vibration that resonated deep within my marrow. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and decaying brine. The phosphorescence in the water intensified, blooming into vast, swirling patterns that seemed to mimic the swirling vortex of an unseen maw. Then, the voice returned. It was not words, but a concept, a pressure on my mind, a hunger so profound it threatened to unravel the very fabric of my being. My hands, though trembling, did not falter. I continued to draw, my focus absolute, my will a steel hard point against the overwhelming pressure. The map glowed brighter, urging me on, its lines a protective lattice against the mental assault. Each stone, placed with cartographic exactitude, hummed with a faint, resonant energy, a counter-frequency to the entity's vast drone. The entity intensified its assault. Images flashed through my mind, impossible geometries, crushing pressures, the slow, agonizing decay of light. It showed me the true history of my lineage, not as a tapestry of triumphs, but as a long, slow descent into service, each generation a link in a chain, drawing it closer. It revealed the sacrifices made, the minds broken, the bodies offered. It implied that my own existence was merely the culmination of a long-laid trap, and that my struggle was futile. It was not physical, but felt more real than any touch, a parasitic thought attempting to root itself. I gritted my teeth, my jaw aching, and completed the final arc, the closing segment of the containment sigil. As the last line connected, a guttural roar, soundless yet deafening, tore through the air. The stationary waves shuddered, their frozen forms rippling as if in agony. The phosphorescence in the water flared once, blindingly, then began to recede, drawing inward, shrinking, condensing. The entity was contained. The ritual was complete. But the cost. The cost was immediate and absolute. As the last vestige of its presence pulled back, it did not merely vanish. It tore a piece of me away. Memories, specific and cherished, dissolved like smoke. The faces of those I had known, their names, the very texture of shared moments, they were gone, leaving behind only the ghost of an absence. My own name, Reed, felt like a foreign sound on my tongue, a label detached from any true sense of self. The map, now inert, lay beside me, its glow extinguished. The stationary waves were still, but now they seemed to mock me, their unnatural calm a reflection of the stillness that had settled within my own skull. The clarity that had guided me was gone, replaced by a profound, echoing blankness. I had succeeded, yes. The entity was bound, its ancient hunger no longer a threat to the world. But the man who had achieved it, the cartographer, the heir, was no more. The world, for a long moment, was a symphony of absence. No shriek, no groan, no rattling breath. Only the slow drift of motes in the air, catching the pale, bruised light that bled through shattered windows. My own breath, ragged and shallow, seemed an intrusion upon the profound quiet. The taste in my mouth was not blood, but something older, fouler, earth and ash and the metallic tang of fear that had been cooked out of me. My body was a map of new geographies, an intricate lattice of aches, a dull throb behind my eyes, and a deeper, pervasive emptiness where a core of dread had once resided. It was as if the entity, in its final, rending departure, had not merely fled, but had scoured a space within me, leaving behind a hollow that echoed with a chill not of this world. I pushed myself up, each muscle a protest, each joint a rusted hinge. The floor, once solid oak, was now a splintered testament to the violence that had transpired. Dust coated everything, a fine, gray powder that clung to my skin, tasting faintly of iron and decay. The estate house, my ancestral home, was a husk. Plaster hung in tattered strips like old skin, revealing the skeletal lath beneath. Furniture lay overturned, disemboweled, its stuffing spilled like gruesome entrails. Outside, through the broken panes, the grounds mirrored the internal devastation. Trees, once stoic sentinels, were now twisted, some rent in two, their exposed wood gleaming white and raw in the anemic moonlight. The earth itself seemed disturbed, churned and scarred, as if a giant, unseen plow had dragged its teeth across the landscape. I looked at them, turning them over and back, noticing the faint, almost imperceptible tremor that ran through them, a vibration that felt less like my own exhaustion and more like a residual hum from a vast, departed power. It was then, in the utter stillness of the ruined foyer, that the first tendril of the true aftermath began to unfurl within me. Not just the physical scars, but the insidious, mental lacerations. It was a knowing, rather than a memory, of the earth's deep currents, of the slow, inexorable grind of stone against stone. I pushed it away, a shiver running down my spine, but it lingered at the periphery, a faint, resonant echo. The night air, usually crisp and clean, now carried a faint, acrid undertone, like ozone in burnt bone. My feet, moving with a will not entirely my own, carried me through the ravaged gardens, past the broken sundial, and towards the distant, low murmur that had always been a constant, comforting presence, the ocean. The journey was a blur of ragged breath and the scraping sound of my boots on gravel and splintered wood. Finally, the ground shifted underfoot, becoming softer, yielding. The air grew heavy with the scent of salt and brine. The vast expanse of the water stretched before me, a flat, obsidian mirror under the bruised sky. The waves, usually a rhythmic pulse, were strangely still tonight, their forms frozen in mid-collapse, a silent, glassy testament to an unnatural calm. It was a stillness that felt profound, a cessation of natural order, and I knew, with a certainty that settled like a lead weight in my gut, that it was a reflection of the unnatural stillness within myself. I stood there, a solitary figure against the immensity, the wind whipping my hair across my face, stinging my eyes with salt. My gaze drifted to the horizon, where the line between sea and sky blurred into an indistinguishable gray. And then, the reveal solidified. The entity was gone, yes, dispersed, broken, exiled from this land. But it had left a mark, a shard of its ancient, terrible knowledge, embedded deep within my consciousness. It was a curse, a permanent scar on my psyche, a terrible inheritance far more profound than any estate. I was no longer merely Reed, the cartographer. I was something else, something touched, something tainted. The world continued its oblivious spin, the distant lights of a town a gentle shimmer on the horizon, utterly unaware of the horror I had faced, of the cost extracted. The entity was gone, but a fragment of its terrible song now played in the quiet chambers of my own mind, a melody only I could hear, a melody that would never cease. No shriek, no groan, no rattling breath. The taste lingered, metallic and earthy, a residue of the earth's deepest, darkest exhalation. Now, the air tasted of salt. It filled my lungs, a cold, clean balm that did little to scour the deeper rot. Yet, the waves themselves seemed to pause, caught in a perpetual tableau of crest and trough, an illusion of stillness that spoke to the deeper stasis in my own being. The light of a distant fishing trawler, a single pinprick of orange, did not waver. The stars above were needle-sharp, indifferent to the turmoil that had reshaped my very core. The grit worked its way under my fingernails, a reminder of other soils, other depths. It had been weeks, or perhaps months, time had become a fractured thing, a series of blurred edges. The estate was a ghost in my rearview mirror, a silhouette against a memory-seared horizon. I had seen to its ceiling, a crude but definitive act, brick and mortar over the maw. The map, my beautiful, terrible creation, lay burned in a hearth, its secrets now buried twice over. Or so I told myself. I tried, in those first days, to re-establish the old rhythms. My cartographer's tools lay scattered on a borrowed desk, the delicate pens, the precise compasses, the fine-tipped rulers. I had even attempted to sketch a new coastline, an imaginary inlet, but my hand faltered. The lines I drew were too heavy, too deliberate, imbued with a strange, almost subconscious knowledge of what lay beneath the surface, not just upon it. The contours of the land seemed to suggest an underlying network of veins and arteries, a skeletal structure that hummed with a low, inaudible thrum. The old man who owned the general store, his face a roadmap of sun-creased wrinkles, would offer a kind word, a query about my well-being. He spoke of fishing seasons, of the changing weather, of mundane human concerns. And I would listen, my gaze drifting past him, seeing not the shelves of canned goods but the invisible fault lines beneath the floor, the silent pressure building in the deep earth. Not truly. The entity, the thing I had sought to bury, had left its indelible mark. It was not a physical scar, but a resonance within my bones, a subtle shift in my perception. I saw the world differently now. The roots of a gnarled cypress seemed to grasp not just the soil, but something far deeper, far older. I had gained a new kind of sight, a cartographer's understanding of the subterranean, but it was a sight tainted, a gift from a malevolent source. It was this lingering awareness, this constant, unnerving connection to the vast, patient hunger beneath the surface. I was its unwitting witness, its unwilling custodian. I had not destroyed it, I had merely contained it, and in doing so, had become a part of its silent, enduring saga. The wind whipped a strand of hair across my face. The stationary waves continued. Their silent performance, an endless, unmoving dance. Was I guarding the secret, forever vigilant against its return? The shore stretched endlessly, and the night held its breath, waiting.